A loving Heavenly Parent, Father, we thank you so much that we are able to gather again this evening from all over Britain and Europe and from other countries as well. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to do these kind of workshops, these kind of lectures. And even though there's this terrible situation with the coronavirus, but still, Father, it creates new opportunities and to be able to do different things. I pray, Heavenly Father, you'll guide us as we study together this evening, that we can have an open heart and clear mind to be able to work out the way that you've been working through history and to appreciate all the incredible challenges that so many people faced to be able to advance your providence, sometimes be able to rise to the challenge and turn the wheel of history in a good direction, sometimes being unable to, and allowing things to continue in the wrong way. And Father, whatever people did, we want to appreciate the incredible situation that they found themselves in. And because of what they did, we're able to enjoy this extraordinary freedoms that we have today. I ask your blessing upon this evening. I ask this in my name, William Haynes of Central Blessed Family. Jew.
Adieu.
So good evening, and we'll just carry on where we left off yesterday. As I was just saying, we're tracing God's providence from the Renaissance through to the Lord to the Second Advent, and then looking at the moment at the Renaissance. And yesterday we were looking at the impetus behind the Renaissance, why it started in Florence, what were the kind of conditions there which enable people to be able to pursue beauty, truth, and goodness. It's not that the people in Florence were any different to any other human beings, but because of the external environment and situation, they had the opportunity to be able to be creative and to do the things that they did. And that gradually spread throughout Tuscany, throughout the Italian peninsula, to different city-states. And then gradually that spirit of the Renaissance started spreading throughout Europe. And we looked at that, how it affected the development of science. And we saw there the unity, basically, the unity of science and religion, how all the great scientists are all people of profound faith. And also the church itself sponsored scientific discovery and endeavors. And we looked lastly at Galileo and the problem there, not there was a conflict with religion, but it was a conflict with other academic scholars because his views were different to theirs. So I want to look now, carry on from that, looking at Francis Bacon, because he was a great scientist. He's often called the father of empiricism, and who developed what's now regarded as being the scientific method. So he said, what's important then is we need to have careful observation. In other words, we need to observe the world in which we're looking, in which we're living, and then we need to reflect upon all the things that we observe. And then based upon that, he talked about something called inductive reasoning, collecting together all the things that we observe, these observations, the information, and the facts and the data that we've observed. And on the basis of that, try to develop a theory about how things work. And he emphasized here the importance of experimentation. And so that became the basis of what we now call modern day science. He took basically a very skeptical and a methodical approach to what he was doing. And one of the main things he talked about here was that you have to do it like this. You have to observe, and it may be that what you observe and the conclusions that you come to may contradict what you find in Aristotle. This is the problem that Galileo had. He was observing things, he came to his conclusions, but the conclusions contradicted Aristotelian science. And so, Francis Bacon emphasized the importance here of careful observation. And just because you come to conclusions which may be different to what you find in the Bible or different to what you find in Aristotle, one needs to go along with that. At the same time, as well as being a scientist, he was also a devout Anglican. He was English. And he said, God has in fact written 2 books, not just one. The one is obviously the Bible. Of course, we're all familiar with the first book he wrote, namely Scripture. but he's written a second book called Creation. So we're very familiar with this kind of argument. If you want to understand what God is like, then you study, you look at the natural world. Yeah, you can find God there. It's a very traditional and very typical attitude and outlook. And so that's the end of the science part. So going back to Renaissance, basically the word means rebirth or rediscovery and rebirth of classical learning, which was rediscovered when a lot of it was brought over from Constantinople. But the Renaissance took different forms in different places. Some places it was more artistically orientated, some there's more focus on literature, some science. Also, it happened at different times. It wasn't all happening at the same time in the same place. Usually just a few leading members of society who became interested in these kind of ideas, interested in this kind of approach, trying to, do these things. And over a period of several hundred years. I can describe it basically as a renewal and reform of art. We looked at Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and all that whole school that developed there, of literature to look at, science, which we've been looking at, commerce. As I said, in Tuscany, it was phenomenally wealthy because of the merchants and commerce and business and accounting and banking. The Italian bankers were the most first bankers, really. Architecture, again, you can see the extraordinary changes in architecture, again, with the rediscovery of these Greek textbooks on architecture. Sculpture, again, from the Greeks, and the reform also of institutions. People started to feel, well, a lot of these institutions, they're really just based upon tradition, but actually they need to be reformed. They need to be improved. They need to be renewed. Yes, we cannot just carry on doing things the same old way. We need to reform things, renew things, and improve things. And this then became the sort of birth of what we now call modernity. This continuous desire to improve things, to renew things, to make things better. For thousands of years, nothing very much really changed. From this time here, the Renaissance, is the birth of modernity, which we're still living in today, and this continual desire for improvement, and also reform of education. And at the same time, the Renaissance began in times of religious turmoil. So we were looking at in the last series about, also at the beginning of this one, about the reality of the state of the Catholic Church in Western Europe, how corrupt the corruption, the way that people have been persecuted and heretics have been burnt and stake and put to death. At the same time as all that religious turmoil, when the papacy split into two and then to three popes. And then we had the Lollards and Wycliffe. So there was a lot of religious turmoil taking place at the same time. And the Renaissance then, it began during this time. So it's natural then that this desire for reform and renewal and improvement would affect not just the arts and literature and science, but also people would start to think, well, actually, we need to renew the church. We need to renew religion. We need to renew our theology. We need to, we cannot be still living in that old-fashioned medieval world. We need to renew things. And so it had a huge impact then, the Renaissance, particularly on the way people perceived the relationship between man and God. So in terms of literature, this is the Renaissance and literature. Some of it started quite early. There was a Dante, the Divine Comedy, very, very influential piece of work, and Petrarch, and then Boccaccio in Italy, the Decameron. In England, the same sort of time is interesting. There's someone called Geoffrey Chaucer. He's not regarded as, even though he's living at the same time as Boccaccio and after Dante, yet in reality, his world was still the world of the Middle Ages and incredibly medieval. His books, Canterbury Tales. And then, of course, in Spain, you have this great author, Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote. And one of the most important things that happened at this time of the Renaissance was invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg. And the first thing he printed was a German poem. Then, of course, he printed the Bible. And this is a copy, an example of the Gutenberg Bible. And so, of course, this meant it's possible to print thousands and thousands of books relatively cheaply. And so this meant it became possible for people to be able to acquire them. Before this, they were either written out by hand, manuscripts, which of course took a long time, and also was phenomenally expensive. And then there were sort of printing, but then it was incredibly slow. So Gutenberg then, with a movable type, it was possible to print things much more quickly and much greater quantities. And so this then meant that when the literature was written, it was disseminated far more widely than it ever had been before. And lots of people were able to read the kind of books, read the kind of poetry, the literature has been produced, instead of just remaining amongst a very small group of people. Anyway, had Enlightenment also developed, Renaissance also developed in England, particularly in terms of literature. There was Sir Thomas More, wrote a book called Utopia during the time of Henry VIII, we'll come to later. This is followed by an Elizabethan author, a Renaissance man, Sir Walter Raleigh, who was also a sailor. And there's a school, a group of people around him, people like Christopher Marlowe, wrote Dr. Faustus. And of course, one of the most famous, probably the most famous, was William Shakespeare, probably one of the greatest playwrights and poets in the world. So this is a little example here of his poetry, one of his sonnets. Well, he's well known for writing lots of love sonnets. This is kind of an interesting one. Coral is far more red than, so he's writing here about the lady he's married to. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun, they're dark. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her hair. He's not being very complimentary about this lady. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. So it's interesting here. It's a different kind of love poetry. Usually when people wrote love poetry, they'd be saying how the woman they love is like this and like that, and even more beautiful than flowers, even more beautiful than this. Whereas here he's saying that the person he loves is not really very beautiful, but actually he loves her because of something else, not just the external beauty, the external form. There's something on the inside, which is what, that's why he says, my love is rare. So that's interesting. He wrote lots of different, very, very nuanced kind of person, Shakespeare. And then after Shakespeare, another poet, Edmund Spenser, wrote The Faerie Queen, John Milton, Paradise Lost. And he was an interesting person as well. Paradise Lost is an epic poem based upon the story in Genesis in the Garden of Eden. It's an epic. And it has lots of very profound insights into human nature, very profound insights into the fall and recognizing it as the sexual dimension to it, and also very profound insights into the mind of Lucifer. It's really interesting to read. So these are sort of things that Lucifer says in this poem, Paradise Lost. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. True. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. That's Lucifer speaking. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. Me miserable, which way shall I fly? Infinite wrath and infinite despair. Which way I fly is hell, myself am hell, and in the deepest and in the lowest deep, a lower deep. still threatening to devour me, opens wide, to which the hell I suffer seems a heaven. So again, it's exploring the depths of despair, the depths of depression, the depths of hell. It's a really interesting insight into, you might say, fallen nature, but anyway, basically a very profound and deep insight into human nature. So you find Adam speaking, you find Eve speaking, you find Lucifer speaking, and here he uses extraordinary imagination to be able to give voice to the kind of thoughts and feelings, what was going on in each one of them. Also has another part called Paradise Regained, which is much more hopeful. Yet he who reigns within himself and rules passions, desires, and fears is more a king. Just what Father said. He who wants to rule the universe has to first rule himself. Just, these are just typical Christian insights which you find. So you can see here in this literature then, is permeated by the Hebraic tradition, is permeated by biblical thoughts. Shakespeare as well, all of Shakespeare is permeated by the Christian spirit. You can see this also in John Milton as well. Less so in someone like Christopher Marlowe, Dr. Faustus. But the interesting thing about Milton, he wasn't just an extraordinary poet. Also, he was a political philosopher and activist. And he was the first person who put together pamphlets and arguments for the freedom of the press, because he was living in the 17th century, and some law came out saying before anything could be published, it had to be censored. And so he wrote lots of pamphlets arguing for freedom of the press. And it's all grounded, again, not just abstract freedom of the press, it's grounded in his theological understanding of God and the relationship between God and human beings. So again, this is God speaking. For I so created them free, and free they must remain. So his understanding is that God created us free. So because God created us free, then what right does the state have to take away our freedom? What right does the state have to censor what people say or what people want to publish? So again, it's grounded deeply in his theological understanding. So he says, give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties. So here he says, argue freely according to conscience above all liberties. So he's not arguing for the freedom to be able to lie. He's not arguing for the freedom to be able to libel. He's not arguing for the freedom to be able to slander people. Not at all. He's very much aware that freedom means you're free within the law. You're free to say anything you want, but you're not allowed to slander or libel people because that's against the law. So that's what he wants. He wants free, to be freedom, according to conscience. And again, he says, thou canst not touch the freedom of my mind. So again, he's aware that even though he was put in prison several times, but he was aware, even though he was put in prison, he realized the person who put him in prison could not touch the freedom of his mind. He realized he had this inner freedom to be able to think and to pray and to worship God in the way he chose to do so, and nothing could touch that inner freedom. Again, these are the kind of insights that we come up with later, hundreds of years later, Viktor Frankl, Solzhenitsyn and people like that. And he was very much aware of that, the importance of inner freedom. And he talked about the important absolute freedom of speech. Let her and falsehood grapple, her being truth. Let truth and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worst in a free and open encounter. So he would have nothing to do with the cancel culture we're living in, where people are offended. And so you have to cancel people's opinions because they're being offensive. No. He said, let truth and falsehood grapple. In other words, if you think somebody's wrong, argue with them. Show them using reason and evidence that they're wrong. Don't just cancel their opinions because you find them offensive or because you disagree with them or because you don't like them. Yeah? So he has a very, very passionate argument for the freedom of the press. And again, as I said, it's rooted This is the beauty of the Renaissance at this time. Lots of strands of the Renaissance. It's rooted in the biblical Hebraic tradition. They got this synthesis here between the Hebraic and Hellenistic traditions. Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image. But he who destroys a good book kills reason itself, kills the image of God, as it were, in the eye. Again, recognizing here, if you're going to go and burn books, burn good books, actually you're killing reason, and reason comes from God. So again, you're killing the image of God as well. So again, his whole argument for freedom is grounded in his understanding of who God is, why God created human beings, the nature of human life is one which is free, and then his whole political philosophy grows out of that. It's John Milton. You have other people. Another great poet was John Donne. So the reason why I'm looking at this a little bit more detail, trying to understand God's providence, how it developed, foundation to receive the Messiah, particularly in England and Britain. So this is John Donne. Again, a very famous poem. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. That's the mainland. If a clod, or a piece of earth, if a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. As well as if a promontory were. Promontory is a large piece of land by the sea. As well as if a manor of thy friends, or thine own were, washed away. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. And therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Yeah. So when the bell is tolling, that's because it's calling people to prayer, because someone has died and they're going to be buried. So don't say, oh, who's that who died? You just need to remember the bell tolls for thee. So here you got this, not only have you got that development of freedom, you also here have a critique of selfish individualism. Don't think you're an island, that you're an individual that can do anything that you want and that you don't need to care about other people. You need to remember we are all connected to each other. Yeah. So when somebody dies, you shouldn't think, well, what's that person got to do with me? You should feel that loss, because that is, I am involved in mankind. So that was this kind of, in the principle we talk about individual truth body and connected truth body. It's kind of clumsy language. This is much more poetical expression of the same basic idea. We're connected to each other. And so that's why I want to move on now to look at some political philosophy during the Renaissance. These are some of the basic assumptions of the Western tradition. This is three basic assumptions of the Western tradition, which have been identified by someone called Isaiah Berlin, who very interesting Jewish political philosopher who born in Russia and left Russia not long after the revolution. So he said the basic assumptions of the Western tradition: man is conceivable only in social terms. In other words, anything not social is not human. This goes all the way back to Aristotle, who I mentioned before, said man is a social animal. Yeah, we're social beings. We exist within society. We're shaped by our family, we're shaped by our relationships, we're shaped by a society in which we live. And that's exactly what John Donne was saying there in that poem. Man is conceivable only in social terms. And then the second basic assumption, he said, is that all questions of value, and in particular questions about the ends of life, the meaning or purpose of life, what one should do, how one should live, individually or collectively, are genuine questions. That is, each was capable of one true answer only, and this answer was, in principle, knowable. In other words, all these questions about what's the purpose of life, how should I live, what's right and what's wrong, there's only one right answer to what is right and what's wrong, and what the purpose of life is. And it is possible, in principle, to know the answer. And the third basic assumption, he said, was that all the true answers to these questions were interrelated, or at least not incompatible with one another. There's one world, one humanity, one set of answers to the central questions, and one set of rules derivable from them for the conduct of life. So this is basically, the basic insight of Father and people involved in interreligious work. They say, when you actually look at answers to the central questions of life, you see there's a huge overlap. Each religion answers the questions in a different way, but there's a huge overlap in the understanding what is right and wrong, what the meaning and purpose of life is, what the rules are, the golden rule, you should treat others as you have them treat you, all these sorts of things are basic, because there's one humanity, all human beings share the same human nature. Yeah. So this basic assumption of the Western tradition. This is Isaiah Berlin. So then you have somebody called Machiavelli, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. He's an incredibly influential Italian diplomat, political philosopher from Florence, who's an advisor to the rulers of Florence and Medicis, and regarded as being the father of modern political philosophy. So a very different approach to political philosophy that you'd find within the Greeks or within Aquinas or these pre-Renaissance and pre-Enlightenment philosophers. They wrote a book called The Prince, which is advice about how a politician or how a statesman or how a ruler should conduct himself. What were the basic principles for ruling? Very, very practical, you might say. Anyway, Isaiah Berlin's commentary on that, and Berlin's very good at explaining what other people thought and the implications of what they thought. So he said Machiavelli's main or chief achievement is his uncovering of an insoluble dilemma, the planting of a permanent question mark in the path of posterity, which is why he's the father of modern political philosophy. Everyone's trying to deal with this question he raises since then. It stems from his de facto recognition that ends equally ultimate, equally sacred, may contradict each other. Yeah? So you may have two ends which for two different people may be equally ultimate and equally sacred, but they may be in contradiction with each other. That entire systems of value may come into collision without possibility of rational arbitration. In other words, you either have to buy into this system or that system, and there's no way in which these two different value systems can be reconciled. Yeah. And that not merely in exceptional circumstances as a result of abnormality or accident or error, the clash of Antigone and Creon. So that's one of the stories in the Greek plays, this clash of what is the right thing to do. Antigone said, Creon said, you mustn't bury this person because he was a traitor. That's the highest value. You mustn't bury a traitor. And Antigone, he is my father. The highest value is I have to bury him. So there's no reconciliation between these two ultimate, equally sacred values. And so, yeah, all the story of Tristan, and this was surely new as a part of the normal human situation. So he said it's just normal for there to be what's called value systems to be incommensurable. You cannot reconcile them. Yeah. And so he said, for those who look on such collisions as rare, exceptional, and disastrous, the choice, which is, of course, tragedy, that's why you have Greek tragedy. So that play is called a tragedy because there's no solution. It ends up in tragedy. And it's obvious from as you work your way through it, that's going to be the outcome, is going to be tragedy, because it's impossible to reconcile these two different worldviews, these two different value systems, these two different sacred ultimate values. The choice, so he said, the choice to be made is necessarily an agonizing experience for which as a rational being, one cannot prepare. since no rules apply. So in that situation there, we looked at in that Greek play, it is a tragedy, and it is an agonizing experience for both of them. Creon did not want to kill Antigone because he recognized she is practicing filial piety. Yeah. So it was an agonizing kind of decision. At the same time, he felt, I have to punish her and put her to death because she's broken the law. So it was really agonizing situation. Well worth reading these kind of plays. But for Machiavelli, at least in The Prince, there is no agony. One chooses because one knows what one wants and is ready to pay the price. So for Machiavelli then, he says, you don't need to agonize about it. Just choose what you want. That's it. You know, just make a choice. You don't have to agonize about it. You don't have to have any kind of inner conflict about these things. That's what you want to do, then just do it. That's it. So he says one chooses classical civilization rather than the Theban desert, Rome and not Jerusalem, whatever the priests may say, because such is one nature, because it is that of men in general at all times everywhere. In other words, it doesn't matter what you choose this or you choose that, and you just choose that because that's what you want, not because one is right and one is wrong. It's just that's what you do, you choose what you want. If others prefer solitude, to be a hermit or martyrdom, he shrugs his shoulders. In other words, he doesn't care. Okay, you want to go and be a martyr, you want to go and do this, you want to go and do that, fine, who cares? I want to go and do something else with my life. Yeah, so there's no sense of, oh, maybe I ought to be doing that. There's no inner conflict. Such men are not for him. He has nothing to say to them, nothing to argue with them about. All that matters to him and those who agree with him is that such men be not allowed to meddle with politics or education or any of the cardinal factors in human life. Their outlook unfits them for such tasks. So he said, okay, these religious people, they can have all their values, but just let them not interfere in everybody else's life. So if what Machiavelli believed is true, says Berlin, this undermines one major assumption of Western thought. Yeah? Namely, that somewhere in the past or the future, in this world or in the next, in the church or in the laboratory with science, in the speculations of the metaphysicians or philosophers, or the findings of the social scientists, or in the uncorrupted heart of the simple good man, there's to be found the final solution of the question of how men should live. So that's what most people assume. We just need to study more, learn more, we can find out the answers to these basic questions of life. So he says that's not true. If this is false, and if more than one equally valid answer to the question can be returned, then it is false. The idea of the sole, true, objective, universal human ideal crumbles. The very search for it becomes not merely utopian in practice, but conceptually incoherent. Yeah, so that's what he's saying. The idea there is such a thing as an ideal or a true way of life or anything universal, he says it's incoherent, conceptually incoherent. And so with this then you have this sort of complete fragmentation to extreme individualism. You want to do that, that's fine, don't judge me. Yeah, I'm just doing what I want to do. There's no ultimate moral values or standards by which people can be judged or can judge each other. It's just utopian, conceptually incoherent, and kind of interesting, these things. Anyway, so that then was very significant in terms of political philosophy. Bengt asked me to mention Nostradamus because he lived around about this time. I've never been interested in Nostradamus, but anyway, I thought I'd better look him up on the internet. And I found that apparently he prophesied that Father was the Messiah. Anyway, if you read Nostradamus, you can find various quotes in there where, depending how you read the text, how you read what he writes, you can read into it that he says the Messiah is not going to come to Europe, but the Messiah is going to come to Asia, and he's going to be like this, going to have the name Moon, and this and that and the other. And so, yeah, some people think that. Anyway, throughout history, people have always used Nostradamus to predict what's going on in their own time. And a lot of the prophecies he had, a lot of the predictions he had, they're sort of based upon what you find in the Bible and the New Testament. Okay, so the Renaissance then, it led into the Reformation, as I said, this desire to renew, to improve, to modernize everything also led into the Reformation. So with the fall of Constantinople, as I mentioned, a lot of Byzantine scholars, they migrated, they became refugees, they emigrated, they came to Italy, to the Italian city-states in particular, and with them they brought libraries. They brought their books that hadn't been seen for a long, long time. And a lot of these books were in Greek. So they had Greek versions of the Bible in particular. And so up until that time in Catholic Europe, there was one version of the Bible that's called the Vulgate, which is in Latin. And everyone assumed that this is the Bible, yeah, because they had nothing to compare it with. Now, when these Byzantine scholars came, they came with Greek texts, and they also came with many different versions of the New Testament. There are lots of different versions of the New Testament, and there's slightly different this way, slightly different that way. So as the Latin scholars started to study them, they started to realize, first of all, there's a variety of different texts, and we're not quite sure which one is the oldest, which one is the most authentic. How do you compare this verse with that verse? How do you decide whether this verse is more authentic and this is an older manuscript compared to that one? So it led to develop a textual study and of these manuscripts and very close analysis of the language. But at the same time, when they compared the Greek manuscripts with the Latin Vulgate, they realized, oh, actually there's a difference there between the Latin and the Greek as well. So part of this difference, of course, is the problem of translation. Every time you translate from one language to another, there's always going to be an interpretation. So those of you who can speak more than one language, which I presume is not the English British people on this Zoom call, but everybody else, you know, if you can speak more than one language fluently and you can think in more than one language fluently, you realize that it's impossible to have a perfect translation from one language to another. Sometimes you just can't find the vocabulary. Sometimes, you know, there's always a difference in the texture between one word and another. And so when these scholars started to look at this, they realized, oh, this is the translation, but at the same time, it's an interpretation, and the people who translated it could actually have translated it differently, yeah? And it would have been an equally valid kind of translation. So these kind of things went on. So here you have this tremendous interest in going back to the original text of the New Testament, to study the text of the New Testament, back to the text. And so one of the greatest of the Renaissance scholars was someone called Erasmus. He was a Christian humanist, and he was one of the foremost people studying the Greek New Testament. He lived in Holland, in Rotterdam, I seem to remember. And then he tried to produce a sort of authoritative Greek New Testament, yeah, by weighing up all the different variations and coming up with a version he thought was the earliest and the most authentic. And at the same time, he was very interested in church reform because he thought there's a lot of corruption within the church. And as people started to study the New Testament, they also started to translate it. And so you had, sorry about all the noise in the background. So various translations started to appear. The earliest translation of the Bible into English was actually in the 7th century. There was some beginnings there by Alfred the Great. But basically in England, there was no English version of the Bible. It was all in Latin. And the first person who translated it into most of the Bible into English is someone called Wycliffe. And then he was condemned and his bones were dug up and burnt. And anybody who had a copy of Wycliffe's Bible could be put to death. So this time in England in the 15th century, you could be put to death if you had a copy of the Bible in English. Then somebody came later on in the 16th century called Tyndale. He based upon Wycliffe's Bible, he translated pretty much the whole of the Bible, but he upset and annoyed Henry VIII. And so he fled, he went to the continent of Europe. There he was arrested and he was executed in 1536. That was a penalty for translating the Bible. There were some countries on the continent of Europe where the Bible already existed in the vernacular. And of course, Luther was one of the earliest ones who translated the Bible into the vernacular German. But as people started to study the New Testament and started to study the Bible, and as they could start to read the Bible in their own language, whether it's German or in English, they started to realize there's a huge difference between how the early Christians lived and what the church is like today. And they could see the corruption in the church. We talked about this in the last workshop, the corruption, how wealthy the church was, how bishops lived in palaces, how priests lived in the largest houses in the village, etc., etc., etc. How the monasteries are incredibly wealthy, and how people would buy things, and the incredible amount of corruption. And especially when people started to be able to read the Bible for themselves, they were able to recognize this corruption. And it's this then which started to move into the desire for the revival of the spirit of early Christianity. And that basically became the spirit of the Reformation. So the divine principle, it explains, again, a good summary, what was the main impetus behind the Reformation. So as the people advocated humanism, so we saw the Renaissance scholars who advocated humanism. Erasmus was a Christian humanist. They were all Christian humanists. They weren't atheists or materialists, they were all Christian humanists. As people advocated humanism, they also rebelled against the ritualism and rules of the church, which is constraining their free devotion. So people then, they started to want to recognize their value as a human being, as a son or daughter of God, and they decided, well, why shouldn't I worship God in the way that I want to worship God? And they rebelled against the ritualism, which meant that you had to worship God in a particular way. You had to follow all the rules of the church, not just the moral laws like the Ten Commandments, but there's so many rules you had to conform to, far more than you find in Leviticus. And at the same time, they fought against a stratified feudal system, which we looked at before, a very hierarchical society, and they fought against papal authority, which deprived them of autonomy. So again, we saw how the Pope said, every human being has to acknowledge my authority, otherwise they cannot be saved. So people rejected that, especially when they could see how corrupt the papacy was. They protested the medieval view that faith required unquestioning obedience to the dictates of the church in all areas of life. Yeah. So think about it. The divine principle is a serious critique here of unquestioning obedience, yeah, to the dictates of the church. Now, people felt actually faith doesn't require that. Yeah, I don't have to obey the priest or the Pope. Why shouldn't I ask questions? Why shouldn't I ask questions about the Trinity? Why shouldn't I ask questions about this or that or the other? The people protested against that, which denied them the right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience based on their own reading of the Bible. So we can see this develops with Luther and with the other Protestant reformers. They want to, they've gone back to the text. They're now studying the Bible because it's been translated. And they want to worship God according to what it says in the Bible, the way in which they interpret the Bible according to their conscience. They also question the otherworldly and ascetic monastic ideal which devalued the natural world. So this is the idea, if you're poor, you should be grateful because it means you're going to be rich in heaven. Yeah, so this glorification of poverty, which you saw in many Catholic orders, obedience, chastity, and poverty were the three main watchwords. Yeah, it's good to be obedient and just do as you're told. It's good to be chaste, not get married. And it's also good to be poor. So these things which devalued the natural world, science, and the practical affairs of life. Out of these grievances, many medieval Christians revolted against the rule of the papacy. And this is what's going on here, this revolt against the rule of the papacy. And we saw in the last workshop how the papacy became very, very monarchical, incredibly autocratic, incredibly dictatorial. And that's what people were rebelling against. Okay, so let's see what was going on then. This is what sparked Martin Luther off. 1517, Pope Leo X offered indulgences for those who gave alms or money to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The aggressive marketing practices of Johann Tetzel in promoting this cause provoked Martin Luther to write his 95 Theses, condemning what he saw as the purchase and sale of salvation. The technical word for that is simony. In Thesis 28, Luther objected to a saying attributed to Tetzel: "As soon as a coin in a coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." That was his fundraising technique. You drop a coin in the box, and then you liberate a soul from purgatory, and they go straight up into heaven. The 95 Theses not only denounced such transactions as worldly, but denied the Pope's right to grant pardons on God's behalf in the first place. So that was a really serious issue. He said the Pope does not have the authority or the right to do that. And so he's not acknowledging or recognizing the authority of the Pope. The only thing indulgences guaranteed, Luther said, was an increase in profit and greed, because the pardon of the church was in God's power alone. In other words, only God has the authority and the power to forgive sins. The church doesn't have the authority or power to forgive sins. And so the only people who are benefiting is the church, because it's becoming richer and richer. So that was his critique of that, what was going on. And there he is. And they put them on the Wittenberg Cathedral, apparently, on the front door. And as I said, he said, you know, there's been this movement going back to the text. We saw it in Wycliffe, and we came up again and again, going back to the text, studying the Bible. And so Luther said, when you read the Bible, there's nothing in the Bible about indulgences. Instead, it's justification by faith. By having faith, by trusting in Jesus, by being born again, that is the only way through which a person can receive salvation and the forgiveness of sins. And so he, again, following on this Renaissance move towards studying the text, he said the Bible is the sole source of authority, sola scriptura. If it's not in the Bible, it may be interesting, but it has no authority. So this then is a sort of Protestant thing. The Bible is sole source of authority. The Catholic tradition, within Catholicism, it's rather different. There are various sources of authority. One of them obviously is the Pope, which is well known. Another is the Magisterium, which is the teaching of the church. And also there is the tradition. This is the way we've always done it. There's also the writings of the church fathers. And there's also the Bible. But a Catholic would say, well, the Bible itself is part of the tradition, because when Jesus started, there was no New Testament. The New Testament and the Christian Bible didn't appear till a long time after the Christian church was formed. So the Bible then itself is part of the tradition, and the way in which we interpret the Bible is also part of the tradition. That's the idea of the apostolic succession, which I looked at in a previous workshop, this idea. So Luther then was saying, no, we're going back beyond all that tradition, and we're claiming that the Bible is there, almost standing there by itself, like a direct revelation of the Word of God. It's not the product of tradition. It's not the product of human beings. It's not the product of the church. It's just a sole source of authority. It's a very extreme position, to be honest. Anyway, so what made things different for Luther? Well, basically the political situation. Obviously, the Pope was not too pleased by what Luther had to say. He certainly wasn't pleased by Luther challenging and questioning his authority. And so the Pope thought, and so the Pope sent Luther a letter, and he invited Luther to come round for tea at the Vatican. And Luther, knowing his history, realized what happened to the last person who took up an invitation to go and have tea with the Pope. That was Jan Hus, and he got burnt at the stake. So Luther said, "Thank you very much for your kind invitation, but I'm declining it." And so he didn't go to Rome. And then the Pope sent his emissary, and they had a long argument. And Luther said, "At the end of the day, I'll accept anything you say as long as you can find it in the Bible. Show it to me from the Bible." And it was Cardinal, he basically tipped Luther further into a much more radical position. Anyway, so the Pope then demanded that Luther be sent by force to Rome. And then the German princes, they had to decide, what are they going to do? So we saw there earlier on in the last workshop, the investiture controversy, how it was that the Pope broke the power of the Holy Roman Emperor, humiliated the Holy Roman Emperor by making him stand in the snow for 3 days before he would pardon him. And we saw how the Pope Innocent went round, and other popes went round saying, we have the authority to appoint and depose kings. And so many of the German princes, they were fed up with the interference by the Pope and by other church officials, archbishops and cardinals in politics, claiming they had authority in that area. And so some of the German princes in the north, they said to Luther, "What's your view of church? What's your position on church-state relations?" And so Luther said, the church does not have the authority to go around appointing and deposing kings or princes. And so the German princes said, "Yep, you're our man." And so they protected him, and they wouldn't send him to Rome. And so that's why Luther survived, whereas there's so many other radical reformers or people who tried to bring about reform, they ended up being killed or executed. Luther, though, was protected by the German princes in the north because they were fed up to their back teeth with the continual interference by the papacy. Anyway, so while he was locked away in a castle for his own protection, he translated the Bible into German, and this became the founding text, you might say, of the German language. A very beautiful and very authoritative text, just like the King James Version, which is based upon Tyndale's translation, is a very authoritative text in shaping the English language, like Shakespeare before him. And then part of the reforms that he advocated were dissolving the monasteries and the convents. And so he told all the monks, you can go and get married, and you can get married to the nuns. And so so all the monks and the nuns, they all got matched to each other, and they got married to each other. And according to the tradition, there's one nun who nobody wanted to marry because she wasn't terribly pretty. So Luther married her, and she became his very faithful and loving wife. And so he got married. I don't know if he had any children. He also expected and hoped that Jews would adopt Christianity. You could understand why Jews didn't want to embrace and become converted to Catholicism, but he thought that they might be more interested in converting and becoming Protestants, which they weren't. And so he actually became incredibly anti-Semitic, and he wrote long tracts denouncing Jews and advocating, often the Jews should be killed. And so Hitler, 400 years later, picked up lots of Luther's things and used them. So that was Luther. A few other reformers. There was a very prominent one called Calvin. He was French, and France was a Catholic country, and Protestants in France regularly got persecuted, the Huguenots, and some of them ended up the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day one year, and lots of Huguenots, they fled to England as refugees. So he was a French Protestant, and he rejected Catholicism, and he got into trouble, so he moved to Switzerland, and he went to Geneva, and he traveled around a bit, and he wrote a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, published in 1536, and in it he advocated predestination. Well, first of all, he talked about the absolute sovereignty of God. God is absolutely sovereign, and everything that happens is according to God's plan. And so even before you're born, it's predestined whether you go to heaven or predestined that you go to hell. And so he talks in these ideas of double predestination. So what the Divine Principle critiques of the chapter on predestination in Divine Principle is basically a critique of Calvinist theology, of predestination. And once before I traced this idea of predestination back to the Greeks' idea of fate. But one thing he did do, which was he gave many sermons. He gave thousands of sermons every day. He gave, I think, 2 sermons a day. And his sermons are all based upon the Bible. And I think he gave hundreds of sermons, just working his way systematically through the Bible, giving sermons. And then he became very influential in Geneva. And sometimes people talk about Geneva being like a theocracy, because it was governed by clerics. So he reformed the church, he reformed political life there, to try to make the civil law conform to the moral law as revealed in the Bible. There was somebody called Michael Servetus. He was a Spanish polymath, an incredibly well-educated person, but also he was someone also who was very, very critical of church corruption. And he traveled around, and he met, anyway, so he came across Calvin. He also wrote a critique of the ideas of Trinity, claimed they're incoherent. He read John Calvin's book, and he came up with a critique of Calvin's book. And Calvin was really upset and really angry with the critique. And he said, if Michael Servetus ever comes to Geneva, he'll make sure he's put to death. Anyway, so Servetus was on his way from one place to another, and he passing through Geneva. He was recognized, he was arrested, he was tried, and found to be a heretic, inverted commas, and he was burned at the stake in 1553. So the Protestants, they weren't all advocates of freedom of religion. They wanted freedom, that everyone should observe and practice their religion. And the Puritans who went, so Calvinism then became an incredibly influential doctrine. The Puritans who went to America, they were Calvinists. Now this time, I'll come back to this later, a lot of English and Scottish Protestants, they went to Geneva. People like John Knox, who was a Calvinist, so the Church of Scotland is basically a Calvinist. A lot of people went there from Cambridge, the Separatists, who later became the Puritans, went to America, they were Calvinists. And the reason why they went to Geneva is because at that time, after Henry VIII died, his son, Edward VI, became the king. He was a Protestant and started reforming the Church of England to make it Protestant in theology. But he died very young as a teenager. Then his sister became the queen. That was Queen Mary. She was a Catholic, tried to return England to Catholicism and to acknowledge the authority of the Pope. Obviously persecuted a lot of Protestants. A lot of Protestants fled from England and Scotland, and they went to Switzerland, and they came under the influence of Calvin. And then when they returned to England and to Scotland, they brought Calvinist doctrine along with them. Another very influential Protestant was Zwingli, also a Swiss reformer. He was based in Zurich. Also, he criticized church corruption, and he also encouraged priests to get married. And again, like Calvin, his own preaching was Bible-based. And so Protestantism became very much Bible-based in terms of its preaching. In the Catholic Church, the Bible is read, but it's not, sermons aren't given which based upon and expound the Bible. It's a very different kind of, Bible has a very different place within Catholic tradition and Protestant tradition. As a result of that, though, this kind of work of Calvin and Zwingli, especially Zwingli, Switzerland became split along confessional lines. So even today, you go to Switzerland, go to one village, it says evangelical, I think, or Protestant. Another village says Catholic. So Switzerland then became split along confessional lines. So I just want to come back now, pick up some of the things I was talking about in the last workshop. Tracing God's providence through the Germanic tribes. As I was tracing God's providence through the Germanic tribes, looking through Anglo-Saxon England and how it developed there, the liberal democratic tradition developed there. Then I looked at the Norman conquest, with the Normans who became, originally Vikings, very, very militaristic. And William the Conqueror, he invaded England and he conquered England. And he did this with the authority of the Pope. The Pope said to William, who was a Duke of Normandy, I give you permission to go and invade England. It's like a holy war. And so he felt, okay, the Pope has the authority to decide who's going to be the king. He's got the authority to decide that I can go and invade England, that I can become the king of England. So that's this kind of stuff that was going on. Anyway, so he went off and he conquered England. As I said, all the property became all the land became the property of the crown. He had absolute authority. Feudalism imposed in England. There's an attempted genocide in the north of England. For 200 years in England, all the ruling class, they spoke French. And that's why there's so many castles, because otherwise all these Normans would have had their throats slit by the English. And then these Normans, then they were very militaristic and started expanding into Wales, expanding into Scotland, and expanding into Ireland. So this then was like the end. You could say like this is like the end of this God's providence in the Germanic tribes. You had this imposition of this incredibly authoritarian, almost communist. Yeah, all the land is the property of the crown. That's like communism. Yeah. All the land is nationalized by the king. He says it all belongs to me, and I'm going to give some of it to some of my followers. Yeah, and if I want to take it away from them, I have the authority to do that. And that's the way it was, even till today. That's still the essential legal position of land in the UK. It's all the property of the crown. So he had this kind of absolute authority, and yeah, so you think, okay, what's going to happen next? This is the thing. When that happens, what do you do? What do you do? Yeah, do you say, okay, we'll just go along with this, or do you try to recover things? So what happened then was basically an odyssey for basically 800 years. English history has been an attempt to reverse the Norman conquest and to recover English liberties. 800 years it took till the middle of the 19th century. And so we'll look at this. This is God's providence that developed in the Germanic tribes. And first of all, so 100 years after 1066, yeah, so about 100 years after the Norman conquest, then you have the sort of pushback against this Norman conquest and against this absolute authority, this absolute rule by the king. And one of the first is the Constitutions of Clarendon. And the church then, at that time, throughout Europe, there was one law had authority over all clerics, and a huge proportion of the population, they were either priests or they were monks or they were nuns. And there were two legal systems in every European country. One legal system for all the people who belonged to the church, and that's a large proportion of the population, either nuns, clerics of some kind or another. Anybody who's educated automatically basically was a cleric. And one law, the king's law, civil law for everybody else. And so this was a real problem in England. So this meant if you're a priest and you murdered somebody, then you go along and you would do confession, and then you would be forgiven, and you do some kind of penance. You're like, just doing the Stations of the Cross, or 100 Hail Marys, or a 7-day fast or something, and then you're forgiven. If you weren't a priest or a monk or a nun and you murdered somebody, you were hung by your neck. You were executed. And people felt that's really not very fair. Why should there be one law for the clerics and everybody who's connected and under the control of the church, and one law for everybody else? Yeah. And so the king himself got rather irritated. Why is it that there are, I'm telling you, this is really the way it was. Why is it there's so many priests who commit murder, who are freely allowed to live in this country and go around doing their regular stuff? And so that's why a lot of people wanted to become priests. You could pay some money to become a priest, because when you paid some money to become a priest, it meant you were within the church and you would only be judged according to church law, which of course meant forgiving people. Oh, you poor little sinner, we'll forgive you. Just do a few little acts of, Anyway, so the king at the time, Henry II, he was getting rather irritated by this, and he wanted to bring the church under the law of the land. So there should be just one law which applied to everybody, including priests and clerics and monks. And he was having a big struggle with the church. This is like part of his investiture controversy, part of this church-state controversy. This is in the 12th century in England. The same stuff was going on in Ireland in the 20th century. So he decided, when the Archbishop of Canterbury died, he decided to appoint his friend, or arrange for his friend, who was Thomas à Becket, to become the next Archbishop of Canterbury. Because Thomas à Becket was a very, very good friend of his, and he thought, if I can make my friend Thomas à Becket the Archbishop of Canterbury, then we can work together to bring the church under the law of the land and to reform the church and the corruption, various other things. Anyway, when Thomas à Becket, when he became the Archbishop of Canterbury, it took his duties, religious duties, incredibly seriously. And he really annoyed Henry, because he wasn't behaving like Henry expected him to behave. Instead, he was behaving like an Archbishop of Canterbury, defending the rights of the church and privileges of the church. And he got so annoyed with him that one day Henry II said, who's going to rid me of this troublesome cleric? And then I've forgotten how many, I think 4 or 5 nights they heard that Henry II, king, say this, who's going to get rid of this wretched cleric for me? And so they got on their horses, they rode to Canterbury Cathedral, and then they killed Thomas à Becket, or murdered him, if you like, in front of the altar in Canterbury Cathedral. And so he became a martyr and was canonized. Anyway, so that was what was going on there. But anyway, these are constitutions of Clarendon trying to bring the church under the law of the land, and you got the pushback here from the church, and that led to the martyrdom of Thomas à Becket, and it set that whole thing back for a while. So there's a huge struggle going on there. Anyway, same sort of time, trying to bring back the old Germanic understanding of justice, trial by jury was reestablished and reaffirmed. It had always been there, but now it is reaffirmed, trial by jury. In other words, you can only be put in prison if you've broken the law. And the only people who can decide whether you've broken the law or not are your peers, your equals. 12 men who are your equals. They can hear all the evidence and they can decide whether you've broken the law or not, and they can decide whether you're going to be punished or not. So just because you're the king, it doesn't mean you have the authority to put people in prison. Trial by jury became established. And then carry on in this kind of tradition, trying to recover these traditions of the Germanic tribes. You have Magna Carta. So you have another Norman king called King John, who was a jolly bad king. And he went around trying to stop people from hunting in the forests, and he wouldn't live under the law. He thought, I'm the king. Why should I be constrained by the law? I'm the king. Why should I obey the law? You know, I'm the king. I should be able to do whatever I want. And he really annoyed people. And he annoyed the barons, who were also, you know, mostly Normans, starting to marry into the Anglo-Saxons. And so they decided, okay, look, we cannot have you behaving in this way. We need a king, but the king has to do the duties that belong to a king, and he has to observe the law. And so they arranged for to meet King John at a place called Runnymede, which is near Windsor. And basically said to the king, look, you have to sign this Magna Carta. It's a great charter. Put your name to this or we're going to throw you in the river and drown you. Anyway, so this person called Archbishop Stephen Langton, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. He drew up the Magna Carta. Yeah, he drew up this Magna Carta with all these basic ideas, which now we're very familiar with because they became the basic of the liberal democratic tradition in Britain and America. No person should be imprisoned, deprived of his property, or outlawed, but by the judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. So these kind of things, many, many provisions here to protect and to guarantee people's Anglo-Saxon liberties and freedoms. So it's all here to protect freedoms. An example, this is a copy of, or the original of the Magna Carta. So again, you got this pushback trying to recover these old English liberties that's going on here. So it takes a long time. And some other developments, they start to have the development of Parliament. So instead of having an absolute monarch, you start to have the recovery of the old Anglo-Saxon Wittengemot, as it was called then, where the king did not have the authority to rule by himself. The king only had the authority to uphold the law, but he didn't have the authority to make the law. The king only had the authority to make decisions in council. This is the Witten. He didn't have the authority to make any decisions which affected national affairs by himself. He had to listen to all the advice from all the elders, the councillors, and then listen to the consensus, and then make a decision which was one supported by the advice he's receiving from his council. William the Conqueror had nothing to do with that. Okay, but again, you get this pushback, and you get something called a recovery of Parliament, provisions of Oxford, again, a couple of hundred years after the conquest, where they decide they're going to have 3 parliaments a year. Parliament just means talking shop. It's just a place where people would meet together, representatives of the aristocracy at this time, and they would talk about the affairs. And it was established here, the king cannot act without authority of appointed advisors. So people said to the king, look, you cannot act without the authority of the advisors, and we're going to appoint your advisors. Yeah, you can't choose your own advisors. We're going to decide who's going to give you advice, and you can only act if you have their advice. And that's the way it is till today. You know, we have someone called Boris Johnson. He's the prime minister, and so the Queen can only act based upon the advice she receives from the prime minister. Yeah. And then a bit later, you had the first House of Commons. So the first Parliament was like the House of Lords, just the aristocrats. And then the 1265 of the first House of Commons. This is brought together by a knight called Simon de Montfort. And in the first complete Parliament under Edward I, who Pam, who I can see in my picture, or remember better as the Hammer of the Scots. And the reason for this was, he said, it is right that what concerned all should be approved by all. So here, the first parliament, the oldest parliament is just the lords and their nobles and the aristocracy. But then the House of Commons, these are the knights representing the different villages and different towns. And then the first complete parliament was the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And Edward I said, it's only right that what concerns all should be approved by all. So it has to be a consensus by what happens. So you might wonder, where do these ideas come from? So those of you who are with me when we're looking at Old Testament history, this is where it all comes from, the Old Testament. It all comes from a study of the Hebrew Bible. So we saw Stephen Langton there, the Archbishop of Canterbury, drawing up the Magna Carta. You might wonder, well, where did he get his political philosophy from? The Bible. Yeah, this is well before the Enlightenment. This is well before John Locke or David Hume or all these people. the sole source of political philosophy that these people had was studying the Bible. And when they read the Bible, they found this liberal democratic political philosophy and the idea of rule by consensus, the idea of rule of law. These all come from the Mosaic tradition at Mount Sinai. So that's what's going on here. Consent, rule by consent. And then, things develop a bit further. And so here, the right of the commons to impeach any servant of the crown who done wrong. And so this meant that the crown was no longer above the law. So, we talked about impeaching Donald Trump. Okay, people wonder, where does that come from? Well, it comes from here, that the Parliament, the Commons, nowadays it's the Senate, the Congress and the Senate, have the right to impeach the servant of the crown. In other words, any member of the executive who's done something wrong. So just because you're a member of the government, just because you're serving the king, doesn't mean you have the authority to break the law. You also are under the law. And also the principle here that both houses of parliament are needed to change the law. So the king then, as I said, never had the authority to change the law by himself. It could only be done by parliament. But now the principle is actually only both houses of parliament have to agree in order for a law to be changed. It can't just be the nobles who decide to make new laws which suit the aristocracy and themselves. Also, the House of Commons has to be involved because they represent the ordinary people. So that's a gradual evolution here of democracy. The idea that people should be involved in the decisions that affect their own country. And then out of this, then eventually grows the English Reformation. And we have Henry VIII, who was Tudor, Welsh house. And he got married to someone called Catherine of Aragon. And as far as I remember, she was the sister of the Holy Roman Emperor at that time, Charles V, I think it was. And he loved her very much, and he was very faithful to her. From what we know, married to her for many, many years. She had one daughter, only one child, a daughter called Mary. Henry VIII himself was a good Catholic. He wrote a critique of Martin Luther, and so he got the title from the Pope, Defender of the Faith, because he defended the Catholic faith against Protestantism and against Luther. And but his problem was he only had a daughter. And he was very concerned because he felt, when I die, who's going to become the next monarch? And he felt it should be a man. I need to have a son because there needs to be a strong king sitting upon the throne of England. If there's a woman, then it means that the throne becomes very unstable, because who is she going to marry? This is always a big question. Who is she going to marry? If she marries to one of the English families, then it means that that family within England is going to become dominant. And that's what happened in the Wars of the Roses. Before Henry VIII, and the reason why Henry VIII, the reason why the Tudors came to the throne of England was before then there were the Wars of the Roses between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. And this went on for a long time, almost like a civil war between these two big families about who should be the monarch, who should control the monarchy. And so Henry VIII thought, well, if I die and I only have a daughter, she's going to have to marry somebody. If she marries within one of the English noble families, then that noble family will become very powerful. And this will arise, this will lead to a lot of jealousy amongst other English noble families. If she marries a foreigner, then England then will come under the domination of some foreign power, some foreign prince, if she marries a foreign prince or king. So he decided he wanted to get a divorce so he could get married to somebody else who could provide him with a son. So he asked the Pope, would you grant me a divorce? So the Pope had the authority to grant him a divorce, because the Pope has the authority to do anything he wants, and that's not unusual. It happened. But the Pope wouldn't. The reason is because Catherine of Aragon was, I think, the sister of the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Pope didn't want to upset the Holy Roman Emperor. And so for political reasons, the Pope refused to grant Henry VIII a divorce. And Henry VIII obviously is very concerned about this. Why should the papacy, the decision that is made by the Pope for his own personal political reasons in his relationship with the Holy Roman Emperor, why should that affect the future of England and the potential stability or instability of England? And so he asked his chief advisor, Cardinal Wolsey. They went around consulting all the universities in Europe. There's a whole thing. He spent a lot of time trying to find a legal basis for getting a divorce. Got a lot of legal opinions from the different universities, but it wasn't able to find a way legally to get a divorce. And so eventually realized the only way to do it is to abolish the authority of the papacy, the Pope, within England. And so what he did then, in 1534, there was the Act of Supremacy, and the authority of the Pope in England was ended. So now the Pope no longer had authority to determine doctrine in England. The church in England no longer need to pay tithes to the papacy in Rome, which are huge, 1/10 of the income, huge taxes. And Henry then decided that he was going to be the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. So again, we can see when we look back at the principal understanding was that, and the principal view was that the Pope should be subject to the king in temporal matters. Yeah, whereas the Pope had decided that he had the authority over the kings in temporal matters. So the popes then reversed their position. So what Henry VIII is doing here is trying to recover the proper relationship between church and state, between the king and the Pope. So he declared himself supreme head on earth of the church in England. The supreme head in heaven of the Church of England, of course, is Jesus, but he said on earth he was the supreme head in place of the Pope, who was the vicar of Christ. Anyway, he remained a Catholic. The Church of England remained a Catholic church. It still had bishops, and the same structure remained. The theology remained unchanged. All that changed was who was at the top. And on that basis, then, it's possible for Henry VIII to cajole the bishops into passing a new law enabling him to get a divorce from Catherine so he could marry Anne Boleyn, who just happened to be a Protestant who he'd taken a fancy for. At the same time, he realized, actually, he decided to dissolve all the monasteries. So the monasteries in England, there are lots of monasteries, they owned a lot of land. So setting up the Church of England, separating from Rome, was incredibly contentious. Yeah, a lot of people didn't support that. Huge numbers of people didn't support that. So Henry then, he had to try and secure his position and try to make this irreversible. So the way he did this was to dissolve the monasteries, and many of them were destroyed. It was the biggest act of cultural vandalism in English history. Libraries, monastical libraries were burnt. The monasteries were burnt and destroyed. It was like what the Taliban did in Afghanistan. The same sort of thing, incredible acts of cultural vandalism. Statues are smashed, icons are whitewashed and destroyed. It was awful, to be honest, totally unnecessary. Anyway, so there's a lot of pent-up resentment there towards the Catholic Church, and I think that's where a lot of this came from. But what he did do is he dissolved the monasteries, and he took the land, and he took the land that belonged to the monasteries, and he redistributed it amongst his supporters. He redistributed the land of the monasteries amongst the nobles. So that meant all the nobles who supported him became very wealthy because they got a lot of land. And that meant they didn't want this to be reversed. So they didn't want the Reformation or the separation from Rome to be reversed, because it meant they would lose all their land. So this is the way he secured his position and this decision, by buying off all the nobles and getting them on side, by making it worth their while. As I said, there was no theological reform, and then he got married to someone called Anne Boleyn. She had a daughter called Elizabeth. No, yep, she had a daughter called Elizabeth. Anyway, he fell out with Anne Boleyn, so she had her head cut off. He got married to somebody else, and she gave him a son who became Edward VI. But she died, and he got married to somebody else. And eventually, he was outlived by his last wife, Catherine Parr. And so I think he divorced a couple, executed a couple. I forget now. Anyway, but so when he died, then his oldest daughter was a daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She was, she didn't become the queen because he had a son, Edward VI. Edward VI's mother, Anne Boleyn, was a Protestant. So Edward VI was brought up as a Protestant. So when he became the king, he promoted Protestants to become Archbishop of Canterbury. And with this, then the Church of England was reformed and became Protestant in theology. It remained Catholic in structure with hierarchy of Protestant in theology. Edward VI, though, he died relatively young as a teenager. And then somebody else became queen briefly, but she got her head cut off. And then Mary, who was Catherine Aragon's daughter, she's a very strict and very sincere and very devout Catholic. Then she became the queen. In England, she got the epithet Bloody Mary, because she tried to reverse what Henry VIII had done, tried to reverse what Edward VI had done and her dad had done, tried to bring England under the control of the papacy again. A lot of Protestants were burnt at the stake. The Archbishop Cranmer, Ridley, a lot of Protestants, and they were burnt at the stake because they refused to recant their faith and to go back to Catholicism. And she also married the King of Spain. This was a bad move because then that brought England under Spanish orbit, which is something Henry VIII did not want to bring, for England to come under the control of a foreign power. Fortunately, she didn't have any children. And when she died, then her sister, Elizabeth I, who's the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who'd also been brought up as a Protestant. No, not the daughter of Anne Boleyn, daughter of somebody else, I can't remember now. Anyway, one of the wives who got executed. She's the daughter of Anne Boleyn who was executed, yeah. So she became the queen, and she established what's called trying to establish an Elizabethan settlement, trying to find a sort of middle way here. And so again, there's a lot of persecution. So during this time here, the rule of Mary, a lot of Protestants, they left England and Scotland because the Queen in Scotland at that time, Queen Mary, she was also Catholic, and they went off to Switzerland, to Calvin's Geneva, and they became Calvinists. When Elizabeth came to the throne, these Protestants who were in Switzerland, they returned to England, and they tried to make the Church of England a Protestant church, to reform the Church of England further. So within England, then, you had a lot of religious divisions. You had a lot of people remain Catholics, a huge number of people, they stayed Catholics. A lot of people became Protestants, and some became extreme Protestants, like the Puritans, and some Anglicans. And then there was this, when Elizabeth I reversed what Mary had done, then the King of Spain, he sent an armada against England to try to make England, conquer England and make England Catholic again. So I'll talk about the Puritans on Thursday. Okay, so you have this whole huge conflict within England between huge divisions, a lot of fighting. And so what Elizabeth tries to do, this Elizabethan or Anglican settlement, she says, I don't want to make windows into people's souls. In other words, I don't care whether you believe in the transubstantiation, that when you go to take Mass or communion or Eucharist, I don't care whether you believe this is really the body and blood of Christ through transubstantiation, or if you just believe it as a symbol. I don't care what your theology is and what you believe. All I care about is you just go to church. And you can have your own beliefs can be private. I'm not going to persecute you because of what you believe. You're only going to get into trouble if you don't turn up for church. Okay, so that was sort of trying to find a way to accommodate Protestants and Catholics within the same church. Yeah, that's what she wanted. So the only qualification for being a member of the Church of England was you had to be English. Yeah. So for a lot of people, they felt, okay, that's a compromise that I can live with. I can go to church and I can believe this, and the person I'm sitting next to can believe that, and we can both go along and participate in these rituals, and we can believe different things about them. But yeah, I can, most people then, they felt that is manageable. I can manage that. But there were some that couldn't. They were the Puritans, which we'll talk about on Thursday, and also the Catholics. So try to find this sort of middle way, the Anglican settlement. So if you look at the Church of England, it's Catholic in structure, has archbishop and bishops and priests, but it's Protestant in theology. And also you have priests who are married. So it's a sort of halfway house. So the Catholics thought, okay, we can go along with this because you got the apostolic succession, you got bishops, you got archbishops, and eventually, you know, they were appointed eventually, but before that by the Pope. So we can handle that. The apostolic succession is there. The Nicene Creed is still there. All the confession is still there. So they felt, okay, we can handle that. But then the Protestants said, okay, we can manage that with the theology. So that was a sort of compromise. It's called fudge. You just fudge, try and do a fudge, try and keep everybody happy. But of course, you can never make everybody happy, but you just try to make as many people happy as you can by not being too logical and just being willing to go along with lots of kind of contradictions and live with all these contradictions and just, you know. And so the main, anyway, I belong to the Church of England. That's my church. I love it. I feel comfortable there. The only qualification is you have to enjoy having tea and biscuits afterwards. That's all it is. Got nice short sermons, 10, 15-minute sermons, beautiful songs, hymns, lovely music. The service is about an hour and 15 minutes, never more. And after that, you all go and you share tea and biscuits, you chat to people. And then you have nice fetes and summer things.